Good. Okay, and I'm not going to silence us, because if I can't trust five screens to maintain radio silence, I'm in bad shape. All right. So let me say a couple of things. First of all, this is the second to last of our sessions in the book of Samuel. We will finish up through chapter 20 next week, and then we will take a pause. Hopefully you all received, albeit late, the questions that I sent out, but I didn't send out too many. I sent out 2 questions. And so long as you have the opportunity to read, even if only once, chapters 18 and 19, we should be able to do this. I'm going to make it a point tonight not to try and reread passages. We'll refer to them, but I'm not going to reread them. First of all, it gets my wife all kinds of crazy when I read. She doesn't like it, and I wouldn't do that to her. And secondly, because I think we can do what we have to do this evening based upon your reading. So tonight, we are going to do an interesting study. We are going to study the personalities of we're going to study the personality of 2 historic figures, King Saul and David. Okay. Now here are the disadvantages. We cannot study King Saul and David personally. We're not there. We can't have any firsthand impression. So the only way we're going to be able to study them is through the text. And therefore, the text is going to be the way in which we try and understand them. What you have to do, what we have to do tonight, is we have to analyze a text, see if the text reveals information about the psychological and emotional situations of the characters, and whether the text can only be read in one way, or whether it is possible to read the text in more than one way and to get more than one perspective. I'm going to argue this text can be read in 2 ways from the very same material that we have in front of us, okay? So we'll see tonight. Now, I did say I was going to take a preliminary vote. So without committing you to anything, I'm going to, as an initial response, just to see whether you read, you have to now decide whether you're on Team Saul or King David. Okay, I won't hold it against you. So based on chapters 18 and 19 and what you've read and how you've understood it, how many of you are sympathetic to Saul? About what I expected. Okay. How many are sympathetic to David? Okay, about what I expected. And no fence sitters, that's good, okay? I may not be able to convince you otherwise, but I may have a few more fence sitters when we go through the text tonight. All right, so the second question, now that you've all committed yourself, and unsurprisingly, you endorse the character of David, it will make a great deal of sense that I ask you question number 2. According to Jewish tradition, who wrote the book of Samuel? And the answer is Samuel, okay? He's not an unbiased witness here. Samuel wrote the book of Samuel. So if I say to you, you know, it seems to me that the author of the book has a preference here, even though he's not necessarily coming forth, the author of the book is taking a positive attitude to one of the answer is, of course he is, because it's Samuel, and Samuel already knows something. Of the 2 men he's anointed as king, he knows that God has rejected one and that God has chosen the other. So remember that we are reading this text as it is written through the eyes of Samuel. Now, if I were a critical historian and I didn't believe that Samuel was the author, I could still explain it this way. Okay, let's say I took the opinion that this was a text that was written later on after the kingship of David, and I asked the question, is the author who wrote the book of Samuel, if it's not Samuel, is he sympathetic to the house of David or to the house of Saul? You would probably answer he's sympathetic to the house of David. So whether it was Samuel himself or some other chronicler who wrote it, it seems clear that the person who penned the book of Samuel was partial to the Davidic dynasty. He had interest in the game. He saw David as being the legitimate king, and he saw Saul as being the rejected king. Hi, Phyllis. How are you? There she goes, she's getting it. So obviously, in reading the text, impression that many of you had that, yeah, I am recording. The impression that many of you had that David seems to come off better is a natural impression, especially given who wrote the text, one way or the other. All right. So now, having taken that approach and having known that the text that we're going to read is a text that may be biased, I'm going to try and show you can still read the text in a couple ways. Neil, was that a hand?
Yeah, just
Right.
you've been saying that there's an opinion that Saul wrote the book of Saul.
No,
Yeah.
Saul never. Samuel wrote the book of Saul. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
Samuel. Okay, I mean Samuel wrote the book. Um, but it's saying that it's more favored in David's way
Yes, than Saul's way.
than Saul's way. I
Right.
just want to make sure you weren't saying the wrong name.
Oh, no. Samuel, the prophet who anointed both kings at God's command, he is, according to tradition, the author of the book. Therefore, Samuel is going to have a preference for David because Samuel knows that Saul has been rejected as king and David has been selected. All right. So knowing that, let me ask the first question. And here I'm going to stop talking for a second and I'm going to ask you to respond. It's the introduction. In this week's session, we consider the question of what were the causes of the rivalry between King Saul and David as we read about them in chapters 18 and 19. Now, if you read chapters 18 and 19 and didn't realize there was a quarrel there, you must have not read it very carefully. You know, when a man throws a spear at you to pin you to the wall, that means he doesn't like you, all right? So if you read 18 and 19, it's clear that there is a rivalry there, whether you see it as a one-way rivalry of Saul trying to eliminate David, or you see David is implicated in this too. We definitely know that Saul and David weren't good friends by the end of chapter 19. As a matter of fact, we read in the text that Saul, throughout his life after this point that he turns, seeks David's life. He may have lapses where he temporarily says, I acted badly, but he's out to kill David. It seems that the rivalry is there. Question number one. Were Saul's jealousy and fear a rational or a delusional response to David's growing success and fame? We have seen how David, for a variety of reasons, his charisma, his personality, his looks, his military success, we saw how he is gaining admiration in the eyes of the people, in the eyes of members of Saul's own family, in the eyes of the nation as a whole, not just Saul's officials, but the people as a whole. We see his fame and his success increasing. Saul is looking at that. He is probably feeling both jealousy at David's success and his own relative lack of success compared to David. Saul has slain in his thousands. David has slain in his tens of thousands, all right? And he's also looking at the fact that his own household seems to prefer David over their father, okay? So the question is Saul's jealousy and fear a rational or a delusional response? Anybody want to deal with that? Go ahead, Leslie, start us.
It definitely is rational in one sense. But we haven't gotten into anything, but if Saul is a bit of a narcissist, then it would be delusional also.
All right. One, it does not preclude the other. What Leslie is saying is it could be both rational and it could have an element of delusion or of paranoia in there. I stated it as an either or, but the purpose of that was to show you there are rational reasons for Saul to be afraid here, okay? Even a man who wasn't overcome by fits of melancholy might look at the situation and say, wait a second, what's going on here? Jerry, go ahead.
So Saul has good reason to be aware that David could be a usurper, yet Saul is the one that apparently would do away with David if he could, yet David is not revealing his hand yet. So Saul does have some rational reasons, but where Saul is acting delusional is that he feels he has to get rid of David through his death. And he even promised his eldest daughter to David and then withdrew the daughter and married her off to somebody else.
Very good. All right. So we're going to explore that. Listen, there are two ways to explain this. You know, when you have a king and an heir apparent, okay, even in the best of circumstances, the existing king always worries that his heir apparent, even if he's from his own family, might stage a coup, you know? What was it? Which was the king? I think it was Henry, was it Henry? the father of Richard the Lionhearted, and his father was, I think it was, she was married. He was married to Eleanor of Aquitaine. I think it was Henry II. He had three sons, and how did their three sons spend their time? Plotting against their father. Each one wanted to knock off the old man and take the throne. All right. So when I say to you that it is not unusual that people with pretensions to the throne think about knocking off number one, that's not unusual. As a matter of fact, that often happens. Many people are killed by the people who succeed them. So the difference is David, and this is the point I think that was being made. David never seems to actively seek to kill Saul. I think that's the point. Saul certainly tries to kill David, but David doesn't try to kill Saul. Why is that more natural? Even that can be explained. Why is it more natural for Saul to want to get rid of David than David to want to get rid of Saul? Anybody want to explain that to me? Why? Go ahead, Leslie.
Well, David knows that he's been chosen.
All right. We don't know what David knows. We're going to come to that in a second. What does David know about his
David
future?
feels that God is with him,
He does feel that God is with him, but
being told that God is with him.
he knows that God is with him. But how does he know that? Because he has ultimate faith in God? Or did Samuel, in a previous chapter,
Right, tell him.
we don't know what David knows.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, Samuel anoints David, but we never know whether Samuel told David, Saul is rejected, you're the king. By the way, if Samuel told David that, then David's got a motive. If Samuel has been told and believes that Saul, the existing king, is not going to be king and you're going to take over after him, David now has a motive. He wants to be king, and he has a motive for not killing Saul. Why would David not want to kill Saul, even if he wants to be king? Go ahead. Yes, Joseph.
Well, David has a great wife. I mean, he is the champion. He's the toast of the town. He's Babe Ruth in New York City in 1933. I mean,
very good.
His life's so good. Why even change anything? I mean, Saul is giving him command of all the armies. He's giving him great battles to fight. He's giving him
his daughter.
Yeah, his daughters even.
Yeah. Why upset the apple cart? Look at me. I'm the golden boy. The people love me. The king's son loves me. I'm his best friend. The king gave me his daughter as a wife. Everything's good. All I have to do is sit, and things will turn out for me. Besides which, if you slay a king, you become eligible for assassination yourself. Not even, and then by setting the precedent, you've set the precedent. Several times in the story, David will say, God forbid that I should ever set my hand against the king, Lord's anointed. What he's saying is, I wouldn't set my hand against Saul. And so if I become king, no one should ever think it's right to set their hands against me. Okay? Once you execute a king, you create a precedent. In England, they had plenty of unpopular kings, but it was only with the execution of, I believe it was Charles I in Cromwell, that the precedent was set. Once you set your hand to attack the king, anything can go on. David has a reason, Jerry, to challenge Saul without killing Saul. After all, Saul has the power. Saul has a reason to kill David. He doesn't want David to usurp his throne. David can only benefit by continuing, as Joseph says, to live this wonderful life and continue to gain popularity. So the fact that Saul is the more aggressive and the one who seeks David's life does not necessarily clear David of a problem here. Go ahead, Jerry.
It seems to me that David does have some, shall I say, advantage. Maybe that things have always went well, that he's been successful. On the other hand, it's as if he really cannot trust Saul's family except for Jonathan, because when Saul allowed his daughter Michal to marry David, Saul did it with the idea that I'm going to let David marry her, but he's going to have to go and fight the Philistines, and he may not be successful against the Philistines. And
Saul was hoping he wasn't going to be successful against the Philistines.
right. And also Michal probably saved David from Saul's hand when he went out the window, because she realized that her children would be, it could be in the king's realm too. So I think some of Saul's kids are pretty calculating as well.
Well, the only one who I don't think is calculating is Jonathan. Jonathan gains nothing by befriending David. He not only gets his own father angry at him, but if David is successful, he's lost the throne. The only true relationship, we'll talk about it next week, the only really close true relationship in this entire story is the relationship between Jonathan and David, okay? At least from Jonathan's point of view, it is undisguised love. Now, I'm going to call it platonic love because I know there are some people who have tried to read more into this than there is, but that's completely conjecture. This was a platonic brotherhood between two souls. But we'll come to that in a second. All right. So having said all this, you all agree that there is some rational basis for Saul to be wary of David. Okay, so let me now ask the second question, and then I want to hear your answer to that, and then we're going to go back and we're going to discuss this whole thing. Was David the innocent victim of Saul's paranoia? In other words, David was just he was innocent. He had nothing to do with it. Or did David's own behavior and actions somehow reveal a secret ambition to obtain the kingship in Israel? Anybody want to argue that one way or the other? Okay, go ahead, Leslie.
Well, the idea of being son-in-law pleased him.
Yeah, and he wasn't unpleased by being the son-in-law, even though he makes a pretense of saying, oh, I'm unworthy of this honor. We'll look at that in a second. When the time comes to do it, he happily becomes part of the king's household. It doesn't say anywhere that he is not aware of the close relationship he has with the king's son. He values that. They make a covenant. Did you notice that Jonathan and David, in the very beginning of their relationship, have established a kind of pact between them? Okay, David is taking advantage of his charisma, his personality, whatever, and he's forming bonds. He endears himself to Jonathan. He endears himself to Michal. We'll take a look at that relationship too. So David knows that he is working his way close to the king. If Samuel told him, you are going to be king, David is certainly taking actions which increase the possibility that he's going to be king. He is certainly playing the game in a political way. Okay. All right. Anybody else before we go on? Go ahead, Jerry.
So considering from both sides,
Mm-hmm.
okay, David's getting the adulation
Mm-hmm.
that a king would get
Mm-hmm.
with Saul has his thousands, David has his 10,000s. Yet David isn't saying, hey Jonathan, your father's tried to kill me. Maybe we should get rid of this dude. Instead, he's waiting on his appointment.
Yeah.
But also, in other words, if I project my feelings into it, if I was David and Saul had tried to get me with a spear once, would I want to go back and play my guitar or lyre for him a second time?
No, you probably wouldn't. No, but remember here, when Saul is talking to David, first of all, David is initially not sure. Let me make this statement first. The first time Saul and the second time throws a spear at David, we are told that David was in his presence because he was in a melancholic mood, a depressed mood. Saul could always argue, and Jonathan might say, well, David, you can't take my father's action seriously. You know how he gets when this bad spirit of God rests upon him. That's why you're there, to soothe his spirits. Do you honestly think my father would try and kill a man who has aided the kingdom and helped the people and brought such success to Israel? Oh, no, David. My father certainly doesn't intend to do that. He was just in a mood. And in his mood, he momentarily lashed out at you. Remember, Jonathan initially can't believe that his father intends to do it. He says to David, let me talk to my dad. I can't believe it. And he goes to his dad and he says, Dad, what are you doing? This guy is committed to you. This guy serves you. You've made him, give him a position in the army. You have success under his generalship. That he continues to serve you. Why would you be his enemy? He doesn't know, maybe, that Samuel has told Saul, you're going to lose the kingship. And he doesn't feel the burden too much. He figures his father's king, David's only helping his father's kingdom. Saul, who was risking losing the kingship, says, my son, you're stupid, essentially. Your friendship with David, you are bound to David, has clouded your reason. Don't you see that this man is dangerous? If David had said, Jerry, let's get together and bump off your father, Jonathan may have had a very negative reaction to that. Even though he was David's friend, you can imagine that if David had said, okay, hold on a minute. Okay. You can imagine that if David had said to Jonathan, let's deal with your father, that Jonathan might have said, oh, David's suggesting I off my father. And then his father turns around and says, David wants to get rid of me. Jonathan might have supported his father. Well, yeah, maybe he does. David has got to play the innocent victim here. I'm blameless. I didn't do anything. I helped your father. I served your father. I have only done things to increase his power in the kingdom. How would you even think that I would do anything to hurt your father? No, it's your father who wants to hurt me. It's your father who's trying to kill me. So David has to play the innocent. And then based on that, he has to convince Jonathan to go back and to confront his own father. So Jonathan goes back and he says to his father the first time, Dad, what are you doing? When you were in your mood and you threw a spear, why would you do that? It's only going to hurt you. And the first time Saul says, you're right. Tell David I'm not going to do anything bad to him. Then David gets more success and Saul forgets about himself again and throws a second spear, all right? Eventually, Jonathan knows the truth. Eventually, David says, look, your father's trying to kill me. And Jonathan says, my father doesn't do anything in the kingdom without telling me. If my father wanted you dead, David, wouldn't he have told me? And then David is brilliant. He says, look, your father already knows that you like me. He already knows that we're buddies. He already knows that we have a relationship. He won't tell you because he wants to get to me. And if he tells you, he's afraid you'll side with me. He's essentially saying, David is taking advantage of you. David is playing you, Jonathan. He's taking advantage of your friendship and making it appear as if he's the complete innocent here and I'm out to get him. And Saul is out to get him, let's face it. But by Jerry playing the part, David is very canny. David is a smart guy. His political acumen is brilliant. Go ahead, Jerry, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so here I'll say something regarding Saul. So Saul's psyche and what David knows, because David does know Saul likes to look good and important and kingly in front of the people. Yet David's the one getting all this attention. So maybe David is like really digging it in, like, hey, yeah,
all right,
come and take a look at this.
Jerry, when was the first time that David showed up, Saul?
With Goliath.
With Goliath. Here's this Philistine hero. He challenges all the army of King Saul. Hey, why should we have a battle? You send out your man. I'm the champion from my team, and we'll have a fight. Nobody from Israel steps forward. Even King Saul is left to sit there and realize that he's not going and no one else is going. Then comes this whippersnapper who says, what do you mean he challenges the Lord's anointed? What do you mean why should we allow this to happen? Then the whippersnapper goes out, defeats Goliath, okay, cuts off his head, brings it back to Saul as a trophy. He's already, before the saying among the people, Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. David has already shown up the king. He has already shown that he is, despite the fact that he's not king, he is more famous, he is more popular with the people than the king, okay? There you got it, okay? He has shown up. Now, here's some things to notice, okay? And let me bring in some other things. How is David first introduced to Saul? What is David's first introduction in the original story? How does David ever end up in Saul's court? Yes, you're right, Paula, playing the liar. How did David get that position? Saul didn't know David from Adam.
Somebody recommended him. Who?
Yes, who recommended him?
I don't remember.
One of the servants recommended.
Yeah, someone
it.
in Saul's camp recommended him. David comes to Saul's attention through someone who knows David. And when they report about David to Saul, what do they say? This man knows how to play the harp to soothe your feelings. This man is valiant. He is a warrior. How would they know that? How would they know that David was valiant? He hadn't fought Goliath yet. He probably was, and he was a military man because we saw how he proved himself on the battlefield. But how would a servant of Saul have come to know that? Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay, I'll throw one out there.
Yeah.
Supposedly, let's say the servant of Saul heard or observed that David took care of this lion and this bear that attacked the sheep.
Well, David told them the story about that. He told that to Saul, but the servant is a shill for David's interest. Okay, now, okay. Look, here's the question. Did David know that he was to be anointed king? Did Samuel tell him not only you're chosen, but you're chosen to replace Saul? If David knows that, David has a very important piece of information. He knows, and he believes, because he's a God-fearer, there's no question about that Saul has been deposed by God and that he has been selected. So he knows a couple things. Saul's going, I've been selected, God is with me, and therefore I'm bound to get this. I don't need to assassinate Saul. God is going to do this all for me. I am going to be the king because God has rejected Shaul and he has appointed me. Now, the next thing is, David's got to figure out how to get into Saul's court, okay? He didn't come there originally as a man of battle. He came there because Saul, after his meeting with Samuel, had become despondent, had become melancholy. And therefore, when the time came and someone said, we need, the king is going through these bad spells, one of his own servants said, oh, your majesty, I know a guy who could help you. He's a young shepherd who happens to live in Bethlehem. He happens to be the youngest of a son of a man named Jesse. He happens to be valiant. How he would have known that without knowing David, I don't know. He happens to be a mighty man. Let's bring him. And Saul, who does not know David, says, fine, bring him. David comes to Saul, and what's his first entry into the court? Not as a warrior, but as a physician, okay? He comes into the court to soothe, to heal Saul's melancholy, and he does it by playing. Now, by coming in this way, David is no threat to Saul. Understand this. If David had come in right away as a mighty warrior, Saul might have been suspicious. But David doesn't come in as a mighty warrior. He comes in he's a member of the household. He's a player. He's not anything big. He doesn't threaten Saul, okay? But what he does have is he has access to Saul and he has access to the inner side of the camp, right? He could begin to make his assets known. He begins to let his charisma take its effect. Now, in the second introduction, it's almost as if we forgot that. Yes, David plays. But one day, David, who happens to be a good player, is sent by his father to the camp to send provisions to his brother. Okay? Now, don't you find it interesting? I find it interesting that just as Israel is being taunted day after day by Goliath saying, who will fight for Israel? Who will stand up for God? Your king can't even get one man to fight me. We don't even have kings. We have our local lords, and I'm willing to champion. No one will fight for your king. No one will fight for Saul. Isn't it interesting that David just happens to come to the camp at that time to suddenly hear this message? He comes. How did he happen to come? Oh, I just happened to come. My father sent me with some food from my brothers. He comes to the camp, and then he hears men saying, the king is so distraught that no one will meet this challenger, that the king is prepared to offer his daughter as a wife to whoever will meet this challenge. David says to himself, that's me. And as a matter of fact, after he hears the news once, and his brothers tell him, why are you opening your mouth? Be quiet. He goes around the camp and repeats the story several times. Why? So that someone will tell King Saul, well, there's a young man in the camp who's willing to take up the offer. Was David merely indignant for the fact that this Philistine was taunting the God of Israel? Or did David intend to be noted saying, well, if no one else will do it, I'll meet this guy. I'll face him. Now, it's easier to face him if you believe that God is with you and he's on your side. But David also knows something else as well. He knows that as a shepherd, he has a powerful weapon that Goliath probably hasn't anticipated. All right. So David comes to the camp and he starts saying to everybody, well, why isn't anybody responding? Why isn't anybody taking up the challenge? And finally, Saul calls to David and he says to David, look, David says, I'll do it for you. And Saul says, what do you mean you'll do it? You're a young man. You haven't grown up in the army. You have no military experience. And this man Goliath has grown up in the battle. He's a seasoned warrior. David says, doesn't matter. I can face him. And then David proceeds, you're right, Jerry, to tell him the story about, you think I don't have talents? I once faced down a bear. I once faced down a lion. You think I can't defend myself? I defended myself plenty. Yeah, I wasn't a man of war, but I faced wild beasts and I outwitted them. I protected my father's herds and sheep, and I defeated the enemy. Saul says, look, kid, I don't think you can do it, but if you're determined to do it, you have my blessing. And then Saul does something very interesting. He says, take my armor. Okay. Now, obviously, the armor probably is not going to help David because, again, David is not a fighting man, although very quickly afterwards, he's suddenly known for being a fighting man. It's amazing how quickly after he defeats Goliath, he becomes famous. All right. So let's say David's, you know what? He puts it on. He says, I don't need this. I don't need to go out against Goliath with the sword and the spear and armor and whatnot. I'm going to face him, which, he can have whatever he wants. I'm going to face him with what I got. Well, David knows that if he wins that kind of a fight, he's more than just a hero. He's a legend. Okay. It's like, I'm going to face him. I'm going to face this warrior. I'm just a ruddy, chic, good-looking young man. And I'm going to go out and I'm going to defend the honor of Israel in front of the armies of the Israelites and the Philistines. And all I'm taking with me is my slingshot and my staff. Okay. Well, this is a bravura. This is really a performance. This is, I don't need anything. I'm coming against Goliath. So he stands against Goliath. And when Goliath sees him, he says, what are you doing? Am I a dog that you come at me with a stick? You know, with a shepherd's staff? You think you can chase me, a mighty man of valor, away by hitting me like a dog with your staff? And then he says to Goliath, and when I get finished with you, not only will you be dead, I'm going to feed your body to the wild animals. David says, in your face, okay, I'm coming at you and I'm going to defeat you and I'm going to feed your body to the wild animals, okay? And then comes the confrontation. Now, I tried to tell you that slings can be deadly weapons, and how good, if David knew how good he was, and if he really believed that God is with him, it was to David's advantage to come as he did. What was the disadvantage of Goliath in regard to the battle? Okay, think about Pharaoh and the Egyptian armies and the Jewish people. Goliath's strength becomes his weakness, right? If you are wearing 200 pounds of armor and you are heavy down and you can't maneuver, David has maneuverability. He has 5 stones. If he hadn't hit Goliath with the first stone, he might have missed. He had 4 more shots at the guy, right? David's got mobility. David's in his element. Goliath has to come at him, and Goliath has to get within a certain range of David, okay? At least javelin range. Even if he's going to start with his javelin, he has to get close enough to throw the javelin. A javelin can travel far, but a stone flung from a sling can travel farther. So David has tactical advantage. He can hit Goliath even before he approaches him. And that's exactly what happens. He hits Goliath decisively, knocks the guy out, and then he takes Goliath's sword and he beheads him, okay? The guy is now a legend. Now, Saul must be very grateful that Goliath is gone, and because in the aftermath of this, the Israelite army charges the Philistine army, and the Philistine army flees, all right? So they've won a great battle. Saul has won a great victory. But the victor isn't Saul or the Israelite army. The real victor turns out to be David. David's turned the tide. Now, maybe it was just this young man who had faith in God, or maybe it was a very conniving young man who understood the odds and said, you know what, I'm going to win my fame today on the battlefield. maybe like Achilles, he knew just how good he was, and he knew that he could take advantage of Goliath's faults, even his powerful faults. Whatever the result, that is the moment that Saul begins to fear David. He says to Abner again, who is this young guy? Not necessarily, I don't know him, but who is he? In the idea that he's now becoming suspicious. My thought, Jerry, is that at that incident, this is when Saul begins to suspect David, okay? What does Saul do after David wins this great victory? What does Saul appoint David to? What position does he give him? Anybody? Saul makes David what? Go ahead, Jerry.
I believe his armor bearer.
It says his armor bearer, but as you quickly see in the next chapter, he turns him into his kind of a military sub-leader under Abner. He's kind of a military chieftain. Now, why would Saul do that? On one hand, you could say if Saul was afraid of David's influence, why would he put him in a position to be even more influential? There is a cynical reason why Saul might do that. Anybody want to tell me why? Go ahead, Joseph.
Well, if you put him in battle, there's a good chance he's going to be killed.
Yeah. All right. This guy is so good. I'll put him in the front of the battle troops. Let the Philistines deal with him. I don't have to deal with him. I don't have to kill him. The enemy will kill him. I won't have to worry about a usurper to the throne. I'm going to make him this big military guy, and he's going to go out, and he's going to go out once too often on a mission. The Philistines are going to kill him. Go ahead, Jerry.
So are you saying that King Saul is like, oh, David got lucky with that stone throw. He may have been a good lyre player, but he had a big hit with Goliath. So now we'll see if the Philistines can become unlucky.
And Saul may have been even more calculating. David had the advantage with the slingshot against a single enemy, but put him against the whole army. He'd better start to use the sword and the shield. He might have thought shepherd's trick, but not knowing David's real virtues, Saul may have thought, well, he could trick the Philistine. He outwitted him. But in a battle against an army, David's going to have to prove himself and he'll fall. But imagine Saul's horror when David is successful and Israel is successful, and David's exploits are not only not getting him killed, they're earning him greater fame than Saul's. He comes back from a war. The maidens come out to praise Saul and the army on the return. And they're singing and they're dancing. And what are they saying? Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. You can only imagine both David's reaction to this and Saul's reaction to this. Okay? Saul says, the people prefer David to me. They're accounting to me that I honor, but they're offering more honor to David. And then he says, David has more honor than I do. The only thing I have as an advantage that David doesn't have is the kingship. Maybe he's going to try and take the kingship too. Okay. So here is poor Saul now, seeing that his appointment of his son, David, his appointment of David has resulted in the opposite of what he intended. Now, by the way, let's get to the business of Saul's offer of his daughter. When was that offer made? When was that offer made? Do anybody remember when Saul offered his daughter to, oh, go ahead, Esther? Yeah. Esther, you're on silent yet. Yeah.
I think it was before he went to kill Goliath. He made the offer to anyone in the kingdom.
Very good. He never offered David his merit. He said, anyone who will fight this guy and who lives, I'll reward him with my firstborn daughter, okay? Saul either thought anybody who tries to face this guy's dead meat, so I don't have to do it, or, that no one would take the offer. David comes forth, he kills Goliath. Strictly speaking, David could have said at that point, turn over your daughter. You offered the daughter, I want the daughter. David doesn't say that. Again, he's very smart. If he'd said, I did this, Your Majesty, for the honor of the God of Israel who is being taunted. God forbid that I did this to take the king's daughter. I had no ulterior motive. I did not do this because you offered wealth and offered power and offered your daughter. I did this for the God of Israel. So Saul, taking David at his word, when he comes to marry off his first daughter, does not give her. It's not that he ever promised it to her. It's that he goes back on the promise he made that he would give the man who slew Goliath his daughter. David says, oh, no, I didn't do it for your daughter. So Saul is free to give Merav to whoever he wants. And despite David's growing fame, he gives him to another man. I would suggest because he's already afraid of David, the last thing he wants David to do is marry his eldest daughter. Not only that, Saul is watching this developing friendship between David and Jonathan. He says, oh my God, my son is already enamored of the guy. If I give him now my firstborn daughter, he's 2/3 the way into the kingship. I've got this popularity and he's working his way into the family house. So he doesn't give him his daughter, but shortly after Saul marries off his first daughter to someone else, it's reported to Saul, you know what, Your Majesty, your younger daughter, Michal, she really likes David. She really likes him. Now, why don't you can bring David into the household that way. And Saul sees an opportunity. He says, you know what, I'll do it. He says to David, I didn't give you Merav, I had offered that the man was, but my younger daughter loves you. And my younger daughter would love to be your husband, your wife. Be my son-in-law. And David makes, oh, no, how can I do that? I come from a poor family. And Saul says, look, normally you couldn't pay the bride price. You couldn't afford as a young man the bride price of a regular woman. You can't afford the bride price of my daughter. I'm going to make it cheap for you. Instead of giving me all this money, give me 100 Philistine foreskins. You don't have to give me a big bride price. Just kill 100 Philistines and bring the foreskins to me. Well, Saul understands this. Let the Philistines deal with it. Remember, he's not saying that David should do this as part of an army. He's saying, David, this is the bride price. Instead of a bride price, you yourself go out, slay 100 Philistines for me, bring me the evidence of your slaying them. Now, you don't have to bring their heads. You can bring something else. Bring me the evidence that you've killed them, and I will give you Merav. I will give you Michal. And David says to himself, all right, I may be poor, but this is a price I'm willing to pay. I'll pay that price. Now, what Saul doesn't know is that David's not going to go out alone. He takes, it says, other men with him. And he doesn't, not as part of the war against the Philistines, but David manages to kill 200 Philistines. And then he doubles the offer. He brings his father-in-law to be not 100 foreskins, but 200 foreskins. Now, Saul is caught. He has made a concrete offer. Bring me 100 foreskins, even if you're poor. That will be your bride price to acquire my daughter, Michal, as your wife. David fulfills the condition, and now he's going to be brought into the king. So now he's in the king's household. Not long after that, Saul now actively works to try and get rid of David. Okay, it's clear to Saul now that nothing he is doing is succeeding. Nothing is working. He can't get David bumped off. The Philistines can't do it. David seems to enjoy unnatural success. He seems to enjoy the affection of the people and Saul's servants. He seems to enjoy the affections of Saul's family. So finally, if he can't do it publicly, he's got to do it privately. So what does he decide to do? I'm going to get rid of this guy. And I'm going to do it like the way the Pharaoh's orders the midwives to kill the boys secretly. Saul isn't going to strike at David publicly at first. He's going to try and do it privately. So he arranges to send messengers. In the meantime, David's praises are continuing to grow. He sends messengers to take David at night because David has already been advised, stay away from Saul, my father, when he's in a bad mood. Protect yourself. David's not coming around too much anymore. David is either out away from Saul's power, or when he comes back to the palace to be with his family, he's with his wife. Saul now realizes, if I want to get David, I've got to get him when he feels secure. So what does he do? He sends messengers to kill David. His wife somehow gets wind of it. And it's his wife, Michal, who says to David, look, my father intends to kill you. And unless you escape tonight, you're going to be dead by tomorrow morning. So I don't think Michal was in on the plot on David's life. She wanted to save her husband. She wanted to protect him. So when she hears that there is a palace plot to kill David, she sends David out the wall, and then she hides his absence in the bed with setting these family, whatever they are, idols, figures, whatever, objects of worship in the bed. She pretends he's still in bed. And when the messengers come, Michal says, oh, he can't come, he's ill. Messengers go back and say, we went to bring David to you, but his wife says she's ill. I don't care what my daughter says, go back and bring him to me. They go back to Michal, they go to the bed and they discover David's not there. They bring Michal in front of her father and Shaul is angry. What did you do? Why did you let him escape? Which must have meant that Saul knew that Michal had some knowledge of the plot. Why did you help my enemy to escape? And then Michal comes up with this very interesting, oh, Dad, I didn't really do it myself. My husband must have gotten wind of it and he threatened my life. He said, if you don't help me get away, I'm going to kill you. Why should you die? Let me go. So to appease her father, she makes it appear that David forced her to escape when he realized that the plot was afoot. In fact, she probably helped him. And Saul probably realized that as well. But what is he going to do? Call his daughter a liar? All right. So now David is on the run. Okay. David is on the run. Where does he run to? This innocent young man who is innocent of any pretensions and has no desire to harm Saul. Where does he go immediately after he leaves Saul's presence the first time? Where does he hide? And who does he reveal everything to?
He goes to Samuel, doesn't he?
He goes to Samuel, the man who anointed him, the man who told him he was going to be king, the man who possibly was involved in this whole plot to begin with, if it was a plot. And if it wasn't a plot, at least Samuel knows that David is meant to be king. Go ahead, Esther.
Well, I have a question. When David was being anointed, I didn't understand that he knew that he was going to be king or where this came in.
It's unclear. It's unclear, Esther. It's not that you didn't see. It's not stated. It's said that the oil is poured on him. This Samuel will say to David, God has rejected Shaul and he has anointed you to be king and you are destined. We don't hear that. We don't know why he anointed him. Maybe it was for some other purpose. All was that Samuel indicated this. My own feeling, David knew exactly what was happening. Even though it doesn't reveal it, Samuel had to explain what was going on. And he probably privately, and it's not recorded here in the text because it looks bad on David. It looked like David knew from the beginning what was going on. Then you could say that every single action after the anointment was a maneuver, that David was just a very savvy guy. Come to the king's attention, work his way into the household, make himself prominent. Then then David can be presented as what I think you could present, as a manipulator, as a very opportunistic, ambitious guy. David runs back to Samuel. Why? He needs protection. Who better than the prophet who anointed him, and among the prophets among whom Samuel presides over? Because you'll notice that when Saul hears that David has fled to Samuel, he sends messengers to bring David back. He says, tell Samuel to bring David back to me. And what happens? Time after time, for 3 times, the messengers who go out are unsuccessful. We're told that a spirit of God comes over them and they suddenly start to prophesize in ecstasy and they can't do it. What if that weren't the reason? What if the reason was that in the presence of the prophets and in the presence of the people, they just didn't feel they could bring David quietly back to Saul? So 3 times they try and do it, and 3 times they're not successful. Finally, Saul himself comes to get David. And what do we hear? That even he can't touch David. And in that 3rd attempt, while Saul is busy prophesizing or ranting or doing whatever he's doing, David flees. David gets out. He takes advantage of Saul's incapacity and he flees. And that will bring us on to the next part, because he flees to a place where he is going to try and win protection. Now, I could go on here, and I'm willing to. A lot of other interesting things. He turns to a place. I don't know if you got to this point yet. He comes to the priests in a certain place called Nob. Did you read that yet? And under pretense of being on a mission for Saul, he manages to get food for his 400 men. Did you wonder where those men came from? Was it say 400? I don't remember now. It doesn't say. He had men with him. I don't know how many men he had. but he brought men with him. Does it interest you to know the poor innocent David, who has no ambition whatsoever, when he flees from Samuel's presence, suddenly appears asking for bread and weaponry for his men? Sounds like David is thinking, maybe I need some protection here. Whatever it is, he goes. And the priest says, well, the only kind of bread I have here is holy bread. And David said, well, that's not a problem. My men are consecrated right now, so they can eat holy bread. So they turn over the loaves of showbread to him. But he can't help him. He says, the only sword I have here is a sword you deposit, a sword of Goliath. David says, that'll do. I'll take that. Okay. So David takes the food, he takes the sword, and he flees. And did you get to what happens afterward? Did you know what happens to this poor priest, or did you come to that yet? I won't tell you. All right. Poor priest is going to pay for helping David. The priest doesn't know what David is doing. The priest thinks David is on an assignment from Saul, but when Saul finds out what happens, and he said to the priest who helped David, why did you do this? The priest said, what do you mean, why did I do this? It's David. He's your second, he's an important man in your army. He said he was on a royal mission for you. He said it was an important mission. He didn't have time to collect provisions and the weapons because he was being sent by you. And Saul says, he wasn't being sent by me, and I don't believe you. And Saul's people slay not only Abiathar the priest, I said slay the priest, but all the priests who are with him. About 80 men are slain in this particular locale. So David has not told the truth to Abiathar. He has fled and will cost the priest his life. And furthermore, David has men with him who will now hide out with him, who will now become refugees, and he will generate other people toward him. Now, excuse me, but this sounds a lot like a person who is gathering people together for a coup. He may say, I don't intend to touch it, but he's certainly protecting himself. All right, I'm going to stop here. Have I suggested to some of you a different reading of David than maybe you came up with originally? All right, good. And I didn't take anything but what the text says here. Knowing that the text favors David, you could read all this out of what David did. He got himself to the throne. Somehow or other, someone knew about playing the liar so he could get into the camp. Somehow or other, he's in the camp at the precise moment when the Philistine is taunting them. Precisely at that moment, he takes up the challenge. He wins the battle. He goes on to success. This, if Saul isn't worried about this, then he is delusional. If I were Saul, I would be worried about this, especially Saul knows something that Jonathan and the others don't. Saul knows that the prophet Samuel has told him, God has taken away the kingdom from you and he has given it to someone better than you. And now he sees David and he says, this is the guy. All right, responses, anybody? Go ahead, Jerry.
I was just thinking that possibly David was a very good, shall we say, gambler in regard to the Philistines. You could say he had some skin in the game.
A lot of skin.
A lot of skin, 200 skins. Anyway, yes, you can say that David was he turns out to be brilliant. Later on, you will see that David even joins the Philistine army, seemingly against Israel. If you think he's a maneuverer, a manipulator, now watch. David is very smart and very sly and politically very canny. And later on, he will employ some of the tricks that were employed against him. Remember, his father-in-law sends him out so that the enemy will kill him. When David has an indiscretionary affair with a woman named Bathsheba, he sends her husband out into battle to be killed on the battlefield to prevent the husband from realizing she's an adulteress and revealing the whole plot. Look, I like David. David is an important figure, but he's no Moses and he's no Abraham. David is real as real gets. Anybody else? All right, so here's our, yes, go ahead, Jerry. Oh, okay.
I was just thinking in regards to, from what I studied about Abner, there was questions by some scholars as to why David kept Abner on, being that Abner was Saul's guy. And I read that Abner was also very clever. He was left-handed, but he could pretend that he was not left-handed too. So some really interesting characters.
Here's the thing, when you become king, and it was easy for David to become king because Saul and two of his 3 sons were killed on the field of battle by the Philistines. So David enters into this beautiful poem praising King Saul and Jonathan, and he's let the Philistines do the handiwork. Saul's 3rd son Ishbosheth or Eshbal as a young kid, who is really the only source of authority in Saul's army. The only one who remains from the army after its defeat is Abner. It's in David's interest to cultivate Abner as an ally. David plays the game very well, okay? I mean, he's as shrewd as they come, and I don't mean it pejoratively. He just knows how to take advantage of his situation. Okay, matter of fact, if he were alive today, I'd run him as a candidate for the presidential elections. Anyway, forget that. Anyway, everybody, one chapter, okay? I want to turn next time, and I'll send you notes on this. I want to turn next time to the only absolutely altruistic, at least on one part, relationship in the Torah. On the part of Jonathan for David, it is sheer love and altruism. David did have a connection with Jonathan, and we're going to explore whether, if it did have certain interests involved, I think it was the least calculated relationship David had in terms of, it was the most genuine relationship David had up until this point. Okay, and we'll see next week why. Joseph?
I just want to confirm, Rabbi, we'll have our Exodus class on Monday?
No, I want to confirm that, and I'll send out notice, because this coming Monday is Memorial Day evening, and there were some people who are not going to be able to attend. I will, next week will not be the Exodus session, though I will try and send out everything to you. So next, we will meet a week from this Thursday for the last session of Samuel. And then the Monday after that, we will meet for the last session of Exodus, okay? All right, everybody, good evening. Thank you for being here. It was a nice discussion, and small group works really well. Good night.
Good night.